This movie is unbelievably hot. The actors look good as well, I guess. But I never really picked up on how hot the temperature was in this book and how it just represented a boiling point for the characters. But the sweatiness of the movie is unlike any other movie. And in that way, I think it really emphasizes the anti-capitalistic messages of The Great Gatsby. But it still falls victim or becomes an even bigger perpetrator of some of the critiques outlined by Tyson in her review of the book. Okay, let's formalize that a bit. Although film as a visual media can address overtly the critiques of capitalism leveled by the books through cinematic choices that highlight signal exchange value, class systems, and commodification, the inherent visual nature of films detracts from the Marxist critiques leveled by the books. This movie opens to shots of Gatsby's house. It's beautiful. The extravagant hallways, the piano room, the silk, the pool. It's all just stunning. But it's all empty. That's the shallowness to it all. There's no human life in it. It's just an example of Gatsby flaunting his wealth to, well, right now, no one at the moment other than Daisy. The shallowness is also laid out in the text. I think its most obvious parallel is on pages 45 through 46, where we talk about Gatsby's library and his uncut books. However, this movie's ability to establish Gatsby's shallowness, the shallowness of wealth, and his obsession with Daisy, a key plot point, is only really possible in the visual format, especially so early on. I think that's what's really beautiful about the visual format, its ability to do things without talking, without text. And another example is a pair of eyes. This next part of the film takes a bit of knowledge, and oddly enough, a study from Cornell. This movie came out in 1974. It was directed by a British director, written by the same person who wrote The Godfather. Ryan, I hope you know who that is, or at least what The Godfather is. But yeah, it's a weird movie that uses some really weird techniques, specifically the cross dissolve. Now, the cross dissolve itself is not weird. All it is when there's a cut, rather than just a hard cut, it fades slowly between the two scenes. What is weird is that in 1970, we were going through a dark age of dissolves, is what the Cornell study calls it. Specifically, cross dissolves were only used in 20% of all transitions. This is a far cry from the 1930s, and this is slightly due to technology, but it's also just a stylistic choice, where it was used in 40% of all transitions. Thus, the unusually high number of cross dissolves in this movie is of note. This becomes even more relevant around the 14-minute mark, where a cross dissolve is used to transition between a high-class party that Nick is watching to a pair of eyes looking down on the Wilsons. It's a perfect illustration of classism, i.e. the higher class looking down on lower classes because of their social standing and because, frankly, they don't have as much money as they do. And the simple illusion through the eyes just so eloquently does this. It highlights a central part of this book, this idea of class disparity. Obviously, Fitzgerald does do this, pages 23 and 24. He does describe the advertisement, and then he also goes on to describe the Wilsons. But where the movie takes just seconds to transition between the eyes and the Wilsons, he has to describe the advertisement in one paragraph. Then he has to talk about where they live in a second. And then he starts talking about the Wilsons in the third. This ease and efficiency in which the movie transitions between the upper class looking down and then the lower class as compared to the book better connects this whole idea that the upper class truly is looking down on the lower class. Again, a central part of the book. Let's fast forward just a bit to around the 21-minute mark. At this point in time, they're at the party with Myrtle, Tom, and around that time, Nick looks at Myrtle. We know it's Nick's point of view because of the little bit of camera shake as well as his positioning in the scene relative to Daisy. Then the camera, or rather Nick's point of view, zooms in on Myrtle. Well, Myrtle at first, but then with a bit of glint caused by lens flare. Again, part of technology, but really at this point becoming more and more a stylistic choice. you can tell that it's not Nick's attention or the narrative's attention on Myrtle, but rather the little bit of gem on her chest that's glistening. The glint really just draws attention to this fact. It's painfully obvious that Nick sees Myrtle only for her both figurative and literal value. This really highlights just this commodification of Myrtle from Nick's point of view, even though he really has not much association with her. This is just an embedded part of society at the time, as well as Myrtle's ties to Tom for her social status. Myrtle wholly and completely relies on Tom for her social status and any chance of escape from this quote-unquote valley of ashes that Fitzgerald so aptly describes. Furthermore, this is a big reflection on Tom's social status, this idea of conspicuous consumption, just buying things for the heck of it, just to show you have money. It signals how he's able to use and spend this money so freely, and it's something the book doesn't have at all. We're actually told somewhat about Myrtle's dress in the book, but it's only a short description on page 30 that talks more about Myrtle than the dress itself. Quote, with the influence of the dress, her, being Myrtle's, personality had also undergone a change. This enhancement of capitalistic critiques by film isn't just The Great Gatsby, it's applicable to most films take into the wild. As much as the book is inherently anti-capitalist, it still could be described as promoting the rugged individual, this idea of someone who puts their own needs and their own wants ahead of someone else, and it's just glorified in the American system. But this whole idea really dissolves away in the digital format, especially with the American dream that the rugged individual is so tied to. Because one part of the American dream is the nuclear family. In the movie, we have a short scene where McCandless's mother and father are getting into a fight, and at the same time, McCandless is just describing what his parents are doing. He describes it in a very casual way of just living their life, which can be interpreted as living the American nuclear family life. It really highlights how much we aren't living the American dream. We aren't the nuclear family that's supposed to be perfect. It pokes holes in the American ideals, and it shows that McCandless isn't running away for his own self-needs. He's running away from an inherently corrupt system. Okay, so we've talked about the ways in which this film is inherently anti-capitalistic. Great, the film's perfect. Yeah, no, obviously not. So, what are some ways in which visual media necessarily detracts from some of the anti-capitalistic arguments in the books? On page 72 of Tyson's Critical Theory Today, she argues 3 reasons why The Great Gatsby actually reinforces capitalistic tendencies rather than critiques them. First, the portrayal of George and Myrtle, the 2 fleshed out working class characters in the book,
distracts from
their victimization by the capitalist system in which they both struggle to survive. Second, the narrative romanticizes the American dream by ignoring Gatsby's amoral actions that were required to get to the place he is now. Third, probably most important for our critique, is, quote, the lush language used to describe the world of the wealthy makes it attractive despite the people like the Buchanans who populate it. Let's address the first point, which honestly the movie does okay about. It doesn't make it any worse, but it doesn't necessarily improve on it. There are some cases where there is interclass spite, specifically Myrtle calling George dumb after he figures out that she's been cheating on him, but overall it doesn't necessarily paint George or Myrtle in more of a negative light as compared to the book. In regards to romanticization of the American dream, the movie does start to struggle here a bit more. It's not really because of any film critiques, but it's more a adaptation problem. One example of the adaptation not necessarily holding up some of the amoral sides of Gatsby is that at the end of the movie, Nick never receives the phone call from Gatsby's underworld connections. In the book, pages 166 and 167, Nick does actually receive this call, and he has to say, Gatsby's dead, and he has to confront this reality of the underworld side of Gatsby. But overall, it does feel like there's more of a focus on Gatsby and Daisy's relationship, which is something Fitzgerald wanted, but it does end up romanticizing what Gatsby does do more and more. It's not just limited to The Great Gatsby, though. It's a part of film. You can see it in the Pride and Prejudice miniseries. As a way to appeal to the audience, they wrap it up in a nice little bow. They make Elizabeth and Darcy seem very, very happy. And in the end, this does overall distract from the critiques leveled by the book, but I would argue this isn't the biggest sin film commits. We've been watching all of these pretty scenes in the background, and I think that's the biggest sin. The movie uses aesthetic scenes to appeal to viewers, and this was completely intentional. The director is quoted as saying that he would give up some historical context, or he would just completely throw it out, just to make the aesthetics of the scene look better. It even won an Academy Award for Best Costume Design, because look at it, the costumes really are pretty. But I think the problem really boils down to the medium itself. We as the viewer, when we sit down to watch a movie, we don't want to use our brains. We want to be entertained. We want to watch the good guy get the girl. We want to watch the superhero defeat the supervillain. We want everything in a pretty bow, and we as the audience will make large leaps to get there. So when we sit down to watch a movie, we're entertained, and we're also victim to ideological programming. So how does this happen in The Great Gatsby? Well, as we saw, the movie opens to these beautiful shots, and it's these hyper aesthetics as well. I know that when I sat down and watched it, and I'm sure you just did it, we want Gatsby's house. And this movie is just spoon-feeding us the American dream. We, as Americans, will pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and we're going to go out, and we're going to get that really pretty house. We're going to fill those hallways with something. We'll figure that out. And it's just the fact that we want what this movie so beautifully offers. And in doing that, we perpetuate this cycle. We ignore the fact that it's not people who are inherently corrupt, but it's this commodification, this richness, this excess, this so ingrained part of the system you want to be in that has corrupted these people. And by the time that you make it all the way to the top of the system, it's too late. You've already been corrupted by the system, all because everyone just looks at how damn pretty the movie is. As much as Into the Wild is a bit better critique of the system, it still falls victim to being a film. Imagine how many people have went out and bought a VW bus, went out on a quick journey just like McCandless's, and in doing so they bought their way into the hippie society, right? That's a perfect example of sign exchange value. You're commodifying the bus and turning it into a societal standing, i.e. the role of a hippie. Even if it's not necessarily a capitalistic role, you're still participating in some of the mechanisms of capitalism. It still subtly reinforces capitalism. And that's the problem with film, is it will always subtly reinforce capitalism. It's the same idea as there is no such thing as an anti-war movie. There is no such thing as an anti-capitalistic movie.